Thank you very much, Beyond Binaries, and first I congratulate Beyond Binaries for organizing this, and then obviously I congratulate Sudhir for bringing out this wonderful book. I think we are not talking about farmers. I would like, because farmers movement was over 4 years back, 5 years back, today we are talking about ourselves. Not that we are in some sense related to families that are engaged in farming, just as human beings. I think that is very critical. When we talk about this movement, it has kind of, as it was rightly being discussed, it's one of the largest and most impactful movement we have ever had in human history in recent times, right? Nowhere in the world you have had this kind of movement which impacted so much. And I remember during the movement there was some discussion and somebody asked me, would academics get interested in it? I said, academics will remain interested in it for many years to come. And I think it was in this room that we had Mandeep's book being discussed. I think that was perhaps one of the first book, if not the first book. The first book, yeah. That was the first book which was in some sense a full-length book. The entire book was on the farmers' movement by somebody who had seen the movement from a distance but had also become party to it, who had protested but also was arrested by the police. And that in some sense, that book was very, very powerful statement of not only about the movement, about the Indian state, about democratic politics, as it was being said. So it was actually a context where all these things were unfolding. And I'm very happy that that momentum has continued, right? This was the first book, and then again there were some other journalists. I'm sure there would have been 1 or 2 books in Punjabi for sure. Then there is Ashok Dawale, who is another journalist. He also published a full-length book.
Ashok Dawale.
Dawale is
CPM AAK.
Yeah, activist, political activist. After that, there have been at least 3 edited volumes. All of them have been published, I think, by Routledge. The first of these was an edited book by Shinder Thandi, who is based in Warwick. Then there was a book by David Singh and his mother's name, I forget, Christine. So that was another edited volume on farmers' movement. In these 2, I also had a paper. And then Shamsher Singh also published another edited book on farmers' movement. Shamsher Singh is a kind of sociology faculty at Flame University in Pune. After that, recently, in last couple of months, there have been 2 books of very similar nature, because I've read both of them. One is by this scholar, professor of sociology from Warwick University, Virinder Kalada, who was also doing his field work. And the latest that we are talking about is by Sudhir, Farmers' Power. So I think it makes a lot of sense to me, because first you had a journalist talking about the movement as they see it and report it. And I think reporting is very, very critical. Reporting is what gives us information about the events, happenings. As I said, when he describes about his own arrest and how various people were mobilizing themselves, and he was also being, in some sense, tortured by the police. It was not an easy, simple arrest like politicians get arrested and then they're taken to some jail and given some decent food, and after 3 days they come out with journalists taking their photographs. It was actually a very, very testing time for him as well. And I think after that we obviously engage with empirical sociological work, political sociology, where we look at what farmers' movements were, who were the participants, what kind of politics they had, what kind of achievements they had, how was the movement in some sense carried out with resources, with various other things, and who was it targeted to, and how was it sustained for so many months. We have had discussion on that. Many people initially said it's a movement of the rich farmers, poor farmers are not participating, and that was also state propaganda. Then obviously there was a caste element to it. There was an empirical truth to it. Dalits were participating, but then there were certain conditions under which they could come. Then obviously there were other kind of questions, but still it was a very, very surprising thing to have happened. And it surprised everyone, including the farmers' movement leaders. When they started from Punjab, they did not expect that the movement to the protest to reach on the borders of Delhi. They did not realize that they will be able to carry on for 1 year, as you were rightly pointing out, that lots of us who had nothing to do with agriculture were drawn to it. And I've spoken to many people. There have also been several documentaries made on this, apart from initial documentaries which were kind of telecast, or BBC made a very nice documentary at that time. But after that also many of them have come up. And I was talking to one of those persons. He also said, yeah, they had nothing to do with agriculture. They were not even Punjabis. They just went there and they just couldn't come out. And it was so kind of compelling, and likewise, this was a movement which kind of, I don't know if you have some idea. So at least these two borders, one is the road that goes towards Chandigarh from here, National Highway number 1, or now it is called some number 49 or something. And there's another road that goes towards Rohtak. These two roads, they were completely blocked for like 15 to 30 kilometers, right? 15 to 20 kilometers, there was no way that you could enter the road, right? And that also meant that people who were living on both sides of the road, for them this whole economy was paralyzed, right? When you go towards Murthal, there are lots of big restaurants there, those dhabas, big dhabas, and their business is basically on the traffic that passes. And all of them were virtually shut down. Now obviously government was very sure that it's just a matter of days and the local people will revolt against them, that our economy is destroyed, we are being hurt, and these people have come from Punjab. Most of them initially were from Punjab, and they wore turbans and they kind of used their own language and slogans, and they were very sure. What happened was just the reverse, right? People in Haryana villages, they opened their houses. Young girls came and joined the protest movements. I think there was this girl called Lado Rani. She became the darling of the farmers' movement. And it turned out to be such an educating experience for everyone. So anyone who went there were people, working class people, laborers from UP, Bihar, wherever they were from. Once they came there, they received so much affection and so much, in some sense of belonging, that they just couldn't leave. I mean, I'm not a farmer myself. I have nothing to do with agriculture actually. My family also is not really agricultural family. And I was middle class, scared person, hiding inside because of COVID. And I remember at least 10 hours every day I was stuck to YouTube just watching what was happening. Every day morning you'll get up and there are these channels going. I went there twice or thrice, but otherwise it was such an addictive moment, right? This is not something that happens every day, right? So that is why I was saying that there was initial journalistic reportage moment, and then there is academic field work, empirical movement, and that's what I think Sudhir's book does very well. His reflective, ethnographic, documentation, historical work on that moment. When people write the history of contemporary India, these are documents. These are very, very important documents. And I think what we need to do next, and maybe people like you need to do, is to recognize the theoretical value of this particular moment in Indian history. And to me, I have no doubt, I mean, we are talking about decoloniality these days, and if you actually look at the language of this movement, the resources, the way they mobilize them, this was for the first time that farmers were mobilizing, organizing, protesting, using their own language that came from their own culture. And this was a political language, and mainstream left parties came, but they followed them rather than led them. We have all grown up with, particularly in political science, the leftists have this notion of vanguard party, where there would be a middle class intellectual who would go and give them a vision. Nothing of that sort was there in this movement. These were farmers themselves. And within farmers also, I think Sudhir and Puneet will tell you much better on that. Within farmers also, it was the average cultivator, somebody who has 2 acres, 5 acres, 10 acres. They are the ones who were actually controlling the movement. Leaders had no choice. The moment they tried to move this side way or that way. So that's why I'm saying we are talking about us. We are talking about everyone, right? And I think I'll stop now. And I've kind of given my presidential remarks And now this movement, why I'm talking about decoloniality is something that I think we need to talk about at some other moment, because this was a movement where, as a Sikh, I felt very touched because they were talking about Chardi Kala and Sarbat da Pala and Langars and the idiom of Sikhi. But beyond the idiom of Sikhi, there was also this, spirit which was a very different kind of spirit of solidarity. And it's unbelievable. I think that's why, we need to, because we are living in neoliberal times, and neoliberal times produce a different kind of individualization, and that individualization is actually creating a lot of problems for us. We are talking about therapy these days, and once you are in the farmers' movement, even for 2 or 3 days, perhaps you will not need therapy forever. So that was the kind of sense of cultural solidarity that this movement produced. And that's why all of us have been, in some sense, attracted to it, and it continues to, in some sense, shape my own thinking about agriculture change. I'm somebody who does agrarian studies, and I've started thinking about agrarian processes very differently after this movement, and many of those formulations which come to us uncritically from West, and we accept them. And that's why I think the word that you use for your own forum is beyond binaries. And I think that's very, very important, because we are not talking about binaries. We are not talking about agriculture versus city, or rural versus urban, or tradition versus modern, or peasant versus middle class. And these were middle class. I call them actually in my book somewhere cosmopolitan Kisan. So these were cosmopolitan Kisans who were very knowledgeable, very, very articulate, very reflective, but also knowing what is good for everyone, not just for themselves. Sarbat da Pala. They were not talking about their own self-interest. They were talking about, that's why they could connect with those young women from Haryana villages, and these young women came and participated every day morning. They would come and cook langar, which everyone would eat. And they would spend all their resources. I mean, people spent like really lakhs of rupees from their own houses and businesses, and they felt very happy after that, right? That is where I think the humanity lies. While doing social sciences, unlike those who are in the neighboring building of School of Life Sciences or School of Environmental Sciences or School of Physical Sciences, we are taught to be willing to think differently, right? So we are very happy to disagree. Right? There are different perspectives. Same phenomenon can have different explanations. Questions could also be framed very differently. Framing questions could also create different kind of reactions. For example, when Ajay says, electorally they failed, right? Why should that question come? They didn't come here on an election rally, right? They came here against the farm laws, and the farm laws were withdrawn, right? They never even once said that we will not vote for Modi. I mean, when Takayat's constituency was mobilized, they were all BJP voters, right? Yes, they would protest against BJP, they would protest against Prime Minister. So I'm saying that this is a question that only a political scientist will raise, right? Or maybe a journalist will raise. These questions are raised, obviously. Farmers tried to contest elections. They thought they were also under this illusion that now we are very popular leaders and we'll now become chief minister on our own. So this also raises, for me, a more fundamental question about, how do we, at some level, conceptualize electoral processes? I would not even say political behavior. How do we actually, when does the question of farmers become questions of jats? And when does the question of farmers become question of society? When does the question of farmer become question of nationalism? When does it become questions of, something else, right? So why did it not work? I mean, why propaganda not work? My immediate take at that time, I wrote a piece in Scroll where I said, how can you call a farmer anti-national? So the very idea of nationalism is a very kind of, precisely, mitti, right? So nationalism means Bharat Mata. Mata is mitti. Who is the person closest to mitti? So the point I'm trying to make is that when you have to analyze a movement, political science is very, very useful, and obviously that's where the target is, but you can't do political science without simultaneously thinking anthropologically, right? Thinking historically, right? I think that's where the idea of mitti when it comes to, why did poor people, I mean, places like Sonipat or this other place, Tikri, these are not agrarian regions. These are places where you have shops. Most of the labor actually is not even from that region. They're not cultivators. There are farmers in Chandigarh villages, in Sonipat villages, but not on the periphery. These were not really farmers. What was it that they just morally felt obliged to support them, right? So I think that's where, you can't find these answers simply looking at instrumentally, right? So likewise, when I'm saying cosmopolitan Kisan, I'm not invoking the notion of cosmopolitan in a neoliberal sense, but strategically it becomes very useful. These are not peasant Kisans, right? They were not fighting only for agriculture. They were fighting for all of us, right? They took it up, looking at minimum support price withering away. They were instrumental reasons. But when they came here, they are willing to die for it, right? Why would you be willing to die for 2,000 rupees or 200 rupees extra minimum support price? It was tough living there. And obviously middle class has a condescending attitude. They were basically enjoying themselves. Every evening there would be drinking sessions, and these old men had nothing else to do. They have money and they are villas, and that's why. Yes, that's empirically true. They can afford to take time out, and it would have been only cultivating farmers who would have been able to sustain a movement for a whole year with a plenty of support from community networks. Those resources are required. You can't run a movement for 1 year just by your political energy. Political energy will last you for 3 days, 4 days, 5 days. 5 people can sit on fast and to death. But this was massive. Just think of the cost that it would have made on the resources that would have been required just for supplying water for 1 day. Water, leave aside food, to thousands of people. There were times when there were more than 50,000 people present on the borders. 50,000, right? And you just think of 3 meals for 50,000 people in 1 day. Where were those resources coming from? And who was paying for them? Haryana farmers early morning will harvest all their crop and move towards Tikri border and Shingu border. Le lo jitni gobi chahiye aapko utha lo, jitni sabjiyan chahiye utni utha lo. So I think we are kind of used to thinking instrumentally, rationally, movements are for interests, but there is something more than that. So the language of Sikhi, and now I'm kind of very self-consciously using the word Sikhi, not Sikhism. It was not a communal language. It was not a sectarian language. State was trying to sectarianize it. Yeah. But the Ladorani, who came from a Muslim family or a Hindu family, Hindu upper caste family, saw state's mischief very easily. Because Sikhi was something else. Sikhi had nothing to do with, it has obviously something to do with Sikh religion, no doubt about it. But the manner in which it was being mobilized, which it was being invoked in proper Punjabi. But people just identified with it. That's where you need to kind of go to anthropology, go to invoke, there's these symbols. And this is cosmopolitan. This is not sectarian. And again, I disagree with Mandeep when he's talking about rural sensibilities being different from urban sensibilities. That is where it was a movement beyond binaries. It kind of broke those binaries of rural and urban. And those stay back. We are just doing field work in a village in Sangrur, and when I go to the village and I talk to people, I can see it doesn't exist. Urban binary doesn't exist. These are people who some of them have actually gone to Canada and come back, and they were also present here. And they think globally. They don't think only locally, right? They think locally, but they know where do we stand in the world. So this is not a peasant Kisan. This is something else. Peasant Kisan is connected to those 3 acres of land or 5 acres of land. These people cultivate 5 acres of land. They also see that their dignity lies in sustaining that identification. And this is a self-conscious choice. These are not simply traditional cultures. So these are not traditional people in any sense of the term. When they were sitting here, they were as urban as they were rural. They were as peasant, as middle class, as global, much more than the economists in Niti Aayog. economists in Niti Ayog were very sectarian, narrow-minded individuals. I'm using the word very self-consciously. They could not see anything beyond what would appeal middle-class consumer. That is a sectarian language. While the Kisan was talking about global liberation, they were talking about how land is very central to our being, hond, dignity. These are new language. That's why I think we need to abandon what we have learnt from Western theory and try to learn from what they were trying to say. That's why I use the word decoloniality. There is something in our culture. What we learn from Western political theorists is actually drawn from their culture, right? When Bourdieu says habitus, we also have a category called mahal. They're very similar, right? But mahal doesn't acquire the status of being a concept. Habitus is something on which we spend months to figure out what exactly is he trying to say. Or even things like anomie and alienation. These are regular terms in those languages, or many other words that have become theoretically very profound. And this is why I say when Foucault writes on empirical French history, or Pierre Bourdieu does field work, that becomes theory. And when we do our work, even when it is kind of globally very applicable, that remains limited to a farmer protest on the borders of Delhi, which was there in 2001, 2002. And I think that's where we need to kind of come out of that burden of Western political language and try to make sense of anything that happens here only through that language. And if it doesn't make sense through that language, that means the data is wrong, right? That means the empirical is wrong. The theory cannot be wrong because that came from some grandfathers of political science who were born in Europe or North America who are still living.